tell you a little bit about Black is Back. My name is Rich Piedrahita. I'm a member of the Black is Back DC chapter. And the Black is Back Coalition was a coalition that was founded in September of 2009 with the aim to bring Black people back into political life and to a tradition of resistance which has historically been associated with the Black community worldwide. It's a coalition made up of different progressive Black organizations and individuals that, although we may differ in our ideologies, we come together in our opposition of imperialism and in our commitment to self-determination for Black people and all oppressed peoples of the world. So we organize collectively without having to sacrifice our own unique identities and our ideologies. And we see this as a solution for the overall Black liberation movement, so that we stay on one trajectory. And in 2009, the Black is Back Coalition, we held the first national demonstration against the Obama regime. It was also the first Black-led demonstration against U.S. foreign and domestic policy. And we've subsequently held a march on Washington every year since 2009 to protest the war. And we're an anti-war coalition, and we're redefining what war is, and we're redefining what the struggle for peace is. We're opposed to imperialist peace, and that is a peace that does not change the relations of power between the oppressed and the oppressor. So it's not just enough to say that you're for peace or that you're against the war, but you support the troops, something, which I hear people say that. That's like saying I'm against rape, but I support the rapists, So we recognize that you don't often see the peace movement protest the genocide of Africans in the Congo, or, for example, what's going on in Mali. They're usually only interested in things that immediately challenge the material interest of white North Americans. In essence, the only legitimate wars to them are wars in which white people are dying. But it's these very struggles, like the ones in Africa, that often go unrecognized by the media. They're ignored by the peace movement, but they have a critical significance in the continued survival of imperialism. So we're not only opposed to imperialist wars abroad, we're also opposed to the wars right here on the Black community. And because there is a war being waged on the Black community right now, and these attacks come in the form of mass incarceration, police brutality, gentrification, and of course attacks being made on education, which is why we're here today. So this is why earlier this year, several groups and individual members of the Pan-African Collective for Advocacy and Action, the Your World News Media Collective, the International People's Democratic Burundi Movement, DC Troy Davis, Students Against Mass Incarceration, the African People's Socialist Party, and the All African People's Development and Empowerment Project got together and formed the Black is Back DC chapter. And one of the first issues that we're taking on is the school closings in DC. So if you're interested in knowing more about the Black is Back Coalition and what we do, or if you want to join, there's a table right there, literature table right there with materials and a place where you can sign up and learn more. We also meet every Saturday at the Hoodoo House, that's in Barry Farm, Southeast DC. So on behalf of the Black is Back Coalition, I want to welcome you all to this event, and let's get underway with the program. Our first presenter tonight is from the Pan-African Collective for Advocacy and Action. This is Solomon Kamishon, and he's going to speak on the historical Black struggle for education. So let's give him a round of applause.
Uhuru. First and foremost, I want to say it's an honor to be a part of a collective of individuals and organizations that are Black is Back, the DC coalition. Resistance is something that is embedded within this coalition, and since I've been a member of this coalition with the Pan-African Collective for Advocacy and Action and Your World News, and joining with comrades throughout this coalition, it's been a lot of fruitful work. It's good work. It's work that's centered in the community, embedded in the community. Meeting in Berry Farms, not behind computers, not solely having conference calls on the phone. We on a weekly basis, try to get out and meet in person. But this is an organization I fully embrace and see a lot of positive things coming out of this organization, because this organization is the DC community. This organization is embedded in the community. And so with that being said, it was just a week ago that on this same day, in a different room within this building, that there was a commemoration for the 48th anniversary of the assassination of El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, otherwise known as Malcolm X. And in that vein, I'd like to open up with a quote from Malcolm X, because I think it's quite apropos for this evening. He said, "Education is our passport to the future, for tomorrow belongs to the people who prepare for it today." And I have to say that the Black is Back Coalition DC is preparing, for an entrenched struggle to fight on behalf of a lot of social injustices that are affecting Africans in DC. Africans in the United States have a long legacy, a long history, as Brother Rich said, of resistance to oppression. This includes a strong legacy of resisting oppressive and indoctrination-laden education that has been imposed upon them. From Carter G. Woodson to W.E.B. Du Bois to Nannie Helen Burroughs, I can go on and on. The American-born African's legacy within education in this country is indelible. It's etched in stone and it cannot be broken. Since being violently kidnapped from Africa's shores and being brought here to the manufactured shores of the United States, Europeans have tried their best, their very best, to restrict Africans from being independently educated by one another. And when they could not restrict Africans from being educated, they found it vital to manipulate and program the minds of Africans, making sure that they were doing the educating, and that educating was not being done by fellow Africans. Slave masters knew very, very well that by limiting the access to education, reading, writing, you can go on and on, that in turn, they would be limiting the overall prospects of empowerment and liberation for African people. However, what Euro-Americans did not bank on was the resiliency, the ingenuity, and the collective nature for Africans to bond together, to join together, and to find covert ways in which they would educate one another. That is also a tale that is seldom told within America's public educational systems, whether it's elementary school all the way to higher education. Fast forward to 1954, we have the Brown versus Board of Education decision, which was to be the panacea needed for Africans to attain, quote unquote, quality education. It was to end the so-called separate and equal status that existed in America. And this historic decision was to open the doors to white schools for African students, thus desegregating many schools. The mainstream racist assumption was that African schools were wholly inferior. Yes, it's true that African schools were underfunded and under-resourced, but it's a myth to say that they were substantively inferior. That is absolutely not the case. Prior to Brown versus Board of Education, there were dozens upon dozens of African boarding schools. Today, there are a mere 4. African teachers were truly a part of the community, and their pedagogical approach to education was a reflection of that. They were invested in the lives of the African youth that they were tasked to educate. African youth were challenged academically in the classroom by their elders, all the while receiving daily doses of cultural edification, Many schoolhouses were small, and as I said before, they're underfunded in comparison to their European American counterpart schools. However, these schools were secure, and they were not in constant jeopardy of being shut down, as we see right here in DC, as well as many, many other cities. Because what's going on right now in DC is going on across the country, Chicago, Detroit, we can go on and on. They were highly, and I said before, these elders were very much invested in the lives, the day-to-day lives of the African youth that they were educating. They dedicated themselves holistically. They dedicated themselves to holistically educating African youth. Despite many superficial gains, and I know this may be unpopular to say, but perhaps maybe not amongst this group of revolutionary-minded individuals that I see in the room. Despite the superficial gains of the historic 1954 ruling that desegregated the country's public school system, racist attacks on African youth have subsisted to this day. Because I want you to understand this, that integration only works. Integration is flawed if the integratee has no control over, bringing in their social mores and values into this larger integrated society that they're supposed to integrate in. If you can't come in with your social mores and values without threat of having them suppressed, without having your human rights suppressed as well, then you're better off staying where you were before. You're better off staying where you were before. And when you look at, for instance, the Negro Leagues, just to go on a tangent for a second, when you look at the Negro Leagues, when Jackie Robinson integrated, all right, and they started to take some of the most talented baseballs on the planet from the Negro Leagues into Major League Baseball, slowly, incrementally, they said, we're not allowing, and remember, the Negro Leagues was, at certain times, was the #1 employer of Africans in this country. And they said, no, we're not taking owner of the Kansas City Monarchs. We're not taking the owner of the Black Sox. No, you have to stay there. We're not allowing you into as equals. Okay, we're gonna take your talent, but you keep your ownership there. And with time, it was decimated. So-called blacks were never allowed to fully integrate into U.S. society. To this day, we haven't been fully integrated in U.S. society. So this whole thing about reentry, when we talk about folks coming out of prison and going into reentry into what? We've never been fully integrated into American society. We have never had our human rights fully respected, nor our cultural mores or values. This includes education. Integration of Africans within the U.S.'s white public school system came at the expense of the quality and holistic education that Africans had been receiving within their communities, despite being segregated and under-resourced by way of Jim Crow. Controlling Africans within this newly integrated school system meant new opportunities to mandate what they were taught, how they were taught, when they were taught, and so forth. It made another opportunity to program legions of Africans by way of the youth. And it ultimately meant that programming these African youth would set the table in terms of where they wanted them to be decades and decades and even generations down the line. Education manipulation has also been nefariously used on our Native American brothers and sisters by way of so-called Indian schools, which were also set up by Euro-Americans. This has been a blueprint that has reared its ugly head virtually everywhere colonization has occurred. Whenever a colonizing or oppressive force wholly controls the oppressed group's educational apparatus, it does not bode well for that oppressed demographic. The oppressed force is ultimately looking to continue their reign of control over that group and their resources, thus upholding the status quo. Make no bones about it, America today, the United States of America, to this day, remains a white settler colony. It has always been and hasn't changed since. Think about that July 4th, what you're celebrating. Shutting down schools should be viewed as nothing short of a direct attack on one's community. In this case, we have direct and blatant attack on communities of color, from stolen coast to stolen coast. This continuation of school closings in DC will have an enormous negative impact on youth, families, and ultimately, black and brown communities. These school closings must be stopped. We need to broaden. I know there's been a lot of solid work done by folks like Empower DC who are in the house today. And we look forward to working with you in the future to broaden this coalition, because we need to broaden community demand to end these school closings and then to end the further attacks on education. Public education is a human right. Actual community stakeholders, community members, is what I'm talking about, should control public education within their own communities. So enter the charter school. Bear with me a couple more minutes. Enter the charter school scheme, backed by the likes of Bill and Melinda Gates, the Gates Foundation, Walmart, propping up folks that are coming out of the Eli Broad School, that trains good CEOs and just posts them up to be, remember they used to be called superintendents, now they're called CEOs of school systems. It is nothing. This charter school scheme is something that has developed into a scheme to privatize public education and to deplete teacher unions, all the while keeping TPSs, traditional public schools, underfunded. This is a critical reason why various disingenuous politicians and media heads, and the media heads I'm talking about, if you were to turn on TV right now, you can see them right now on MSNBC or some of the other channels. Yeah, I'm talking about Sharpton and the like. You can see them, they continue to talk about charter schools as this remedy, this fix-all remedy for the flawed public educational system in this country. They've been paid off. They surely have been paid off. Just like they count young black and brown boys and girls' heads as dollar signs, where they're publicly financed, but they're privately run. Some run by hedge fund managers in Wall Street. However, they never speak of, for instance, the Center for Research on Educational Outcomes. That report that came out of that organization based on the campus of Stanford University, otherwise known as the Credo Report. And let me get into the Credo Report, because this is really instructive, I believe. The Credo Report is a comparison of charter schools and traditional public schools. And it studied 15 states, including the District of Columbia, and they found that 17% of charter schools had students that did better on the whole than did their public school counterparts. However, 37% of the time, charter school students did worse than their public school counterparts. Don't tell you that, do they? I wasn't mentioning Waiting for Superman, and all that propaganda. And then 46% of the time, charter school students, there was no statistical difference with their public school counterparts. There are good charter schools, yes, but that's only half the story. There's a whole hell of a lot of good public schools, traditional public schools. And if they had the same kind of support and vim and funding as charter schools do now, there's no reason why that public schools couldn't do the same that they say charter schools are doing. As a matter of fact, there's some good public schools that are doing that. We know that when public schools are funded, when they're funded, they're financed, and they are left to dedicated individuals in those schools doing the education, that it reaps immense benefits. The numbers don't lie. And so in closing, I want to say that as a member of the Black is Back Coalition, and the Black is Back Coalition in general, has never bought into the false propaganda often promoted by disingenuous, yes, white liberals and white conservatives alike. We understand, when I say we, I'm talking about the Black is Back Coalition, we understand the catastrophic impact that institutional racism has had and continues to have on African communities. In 2013, the public educational system in America is just as segregated as it was in 1968 when Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. It is just as segregated. However, here's the caveat. Unlike prior to Brown versus Board of Education, where we had more control of our schools, even though they were segregated under Jim Crow, in 2013, this resegregation has left public schools within African communities, as well as in Latino communities, has left them in the hands of disingenuous non-African entities. Despite the plan, this despicable plan has set African and Latino communities up to be targeted for targeted attacks and manipulation. Black is Back Coalition aims to work within DC's African community in an effort to gain greater control of our schools, our communities, and thus our collective destinies. We simply can no longer stand for African communities to continually lose control over the educating of our most valuable resource, and that is our youth. Attacks on the educational apparatus within African communities is a direct attack on all of us as Africans. That includes Rich, that includes Aisha, that includes Freedom, that includes myself. It is a direct attack on Africans, and you must see it that way. If you see it any other way, you are intellectually dishonest or just simply disingenuous. There's no other way to put it. So I look forward to building with all of you revolutionary-minded individuals in here. I look forward to you coming up to the Black is Back Coalition table, finding out how you can get involved, because we need to broaden this effort. We can't do it alone. We have to broaden this and build it to a critical mass. We don't need 60% of 70%. The lessons that we learned from the civil rights era, that it was 1% of the entire adult population was actively engaged. It takes a critical mass to move mountains. And right now they have slated 15 schools to be closed, 15 to 20 schools to be closed this year. So we're up against it. The clock is at 11 o'clock, and so I look forward to building. Thank you for your time. Thank you, Rich. Thank you, Black is Back Coalition, and everyone that's in here today.
Let's give another round of applause to historical context. As we know, this issue of school closings is not just a local DC issue, it's a national issue. So here to speak on the school closing, that's a national issue, from the Your World News Media Collective is Tim Baldo-Fletcher.
Parents and teachers are waiting for the axe to fall on some D.C. public schools.
Back in 2008, the system shuttered 23 public schools.
It's a community school, and all children should be able to attend their community school versus be bused or have transportation issues in getting to other schools. So this is where I choose to have my child.
And if you look at a map of Oakland, we have the flatlands and we have the hills. In the flatlands, which are less affluent, that's where all the school closures have happened. That's where all the charter schools are. There are no school closures and there are no charter schools in the hills. And just on the face of it, it doesn't pass the laugh test. If charter schools and school closures were the best educational option, then I would imagine to see them applied across the board and in the more affluent communities first. That's not the way it's happened.
Well, after a year of trying to meet with our local officials and superintendent and our board members, we were left with no option, and we actually took back our school on the last day of the school year, on June 13, 2012. One of the major goals is to raise awareness not just in our city, but what's happening across our nation around school closures. And that goal succeeded. We're here in D.C. now, 6 months later, and talking to Capitol Hill about the issue.
I think we are at a turning point, because there are people organizing in different ways all over the country.
In cities across the nation, many hundreds of mostly black schools have been closed down under the pretext of reforming public education. In the process, black teachers have been fired in huge numbers, often to make way for charter schools and corporate-style education. The pace of school closings and teacher firings has increased exponentially under President Obama, as Bruce Dixon explains.
The current nationwide wave of public school closings and teacher firings, which are concentrated in poor and non-white communities around the country, is directly traceable to President Obama's Race to the Top program. Many schools were forced to close, opening the way for chains of profitable charter schools. Results in the classrooms of poor neighborhoods around the country were devastating. But instead of beginning to turn it around, President Obama chose instead to double down. President Obama appointed Chicago Schools CEO Arne Duncan Secretary of Education. A champion of privatization, Duncan had closed dozens of Chicago public schools, many on short notice, some at the apparent behest of gentrifying real estate developers. Duncan fired so many veteran black Chicago teachers to fill their slots with mostly white rookies that teachers sued him for racial discrimination in federal court and won. Duncan even introduced military charter schools in Chicago, in one case handing over a West Side middle school to the U.S. Marine Corps. Race to the Top's 4 federally mandated strategies are school transformations, school turnarounds, school restarts, and school closures. Race to the Top defines a school transformation as firing the principal and up to 50% of the teachers, replacing them with temps and newbies, and hiring expensive consultants, often the same folks who drafted Race to the Top's guidelines or their cronies, to redesign curriculum and personnel policies. Race to the Top calls its second remedy a school turnaround. School turnarounds are exactly the same as school transformations, except that where transformations fire up to 50%, turnaround schools must fire at least 50% of school staff, bring in the same high-priced, run the school like a business consultants, administer more tests, and all the rests. School restarts are the third Race to the Top solution. Close the public school in a school restart, and you reopen a new one with new staff and the connected consultants under the management of a private corporation, usually a charter school, which can use public money to hire even less qualified teachers, can pick and choose the students it serves, and often generates handsome private profits in the name of choice. Race to the Top's 4th is school closure. In a school closing, you fire the staff, you padlock the school doors, and you let families take their chances on the free market or find another public school if they can. The states and school districts quickest to carry out the most transformations, the most turnarounds, the most restarts, and the most school closings are the ones who get to keep or increase their levels of federal funding. Those who drag their feet lose their federal education dollars. The administration says that it aims to reform at least 5,000 public schools in this manner nationwide in Obama's first term. But even if it took 2 terms to do this, Barack Obama is already set to go down in history as the president who's already done more to dismantle, to destroy, and to privatize public education than any president before him. And he's still got 4 more years. Barack Obama is the diseducation president.
Why are people shutting schools down so they can raise money? Because we want to keep our schools open.
To me, sabotage is collateral damage. Using our people as collateral damage. Using our youth as collateral damage. Sabotage is when you close 37 schools that are in black and brown communities and none of them in the suburbs.
I came here to demand. I ain't asking for not a damn thing. I'm telling you that I am demanding an education for our children. We pay the money. We send our children to the schools. They are our schools. They are our children. It is our money. And that's my attitude over all these years.
We want to emphasize in the video is that this is really a national policy approach to target African and poor youth and shut down their schools and force them into these privatized charter schools. And this is not anything new, as Brother Solomon eloquently explained. Even Steve Biko back in the day said, the most powerful weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. And with that quote, he states that if the white supremacist elite that's ruling this country has control of our youth's minds, then they control the future of this country. I also don't want to keep this confined to just a policy level, but expand to the underlying issues that are causing the policymakers to make these decisions. And that being said, I think it goes without saying that we must address capitalism as a root source for these issues. Because what we see going on, not only all across this country, but all over the world, is a privatization of the people's common goods. When we look at the structural adjustment programs that the IMF and the World Bank impose, the privatization of things like water, so poor people have to pay to get a drink. Things like that are going on across the globe. They're taking away education, they're taking away natural resources, They're privatizing virtually every aspect of our lives. And with Monsanto, for example, in this country, they've even patented life. They patented genes. And this is all stemming from capitalism as the root problem. The same capitalism that was built and founded by white Europeans through slavery. The same capitalism that built this country through exploitation. That's the capitalism that is driving these school closures and funneling these students into charter schools. And that's the capitalism we must fight. If we do not fight that capitalism, we are not fighting the underlying causes, and we will just be faced with the same issues again and again and again. That being said, we must unite with everyone that is in that fight with us. Whether we see those school closings in Oakland, Detroit, some of the brothers and sisters in the video you couldn't see, but they were from all over the country and they're seeing these same issues. Even brothers and sisters on the continent, when they see these privatization schemes and they see these attacked through imperialist Western corporations and governments, we must unite with them as well, because we are the majority. They are the small minority that has to control our minds, because they know if they lose control of our minds, they lose the power. Yes. We have the power, we just have to come together and use it. So that being said, I'm looking forward to hearing some other comments from the sisters and the brothers in the Black is Back Coalition to how we can actually work to achieve those solutions and make a change both locally and globally. Thank you.
About another round of applause for Tim. For putting together that piece and for tying in the whole issue to this rotten, foul system we know is capitalism. So, like you said, if you want to stop the school closing, you got to get rid of capitalism. And we just talked about it as a national issue, and our next speaker is going to talk about the school closing as a DC issue. Today, representing the International People's Democratic Movement is Aisha Cleary.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming out tonight. I really wanted to give like a background to what's happening, so we have like a really full picture of the situation that's happening in DC, but everywhere that Tim, put that little video together, that piece together that showed what's happening everywhere. And we have to understand that everything is working together in DC. When we're talking about the school closures that are happening mostly in Ward 8, Ward 7, Ward 6, which is a predominantly African population. At the same time, there's also gentrification happening in those areas. And all of the reasons for the failing schools or the reasons to plow down public housing is because of violence, and say we're too violent, we're not learning enough, and all these other things. Of course, because that's the way that the system has cordoned us off to be. And when we're talking about land that was historically in Washington, D.C., owned by Africans, that has over time been redistricted, has been taken away, has been privatized, has been done all these things, we are talking about a theft of resources of Africans. And now we see, because we work in Southeast DC, so now we see that in Barry Farms in specific, and in different public housing projects across the city, that now we're talking about a violence that's promoted by a consistent and constant presence of the police. And now we have, since one of the first school shootings that happened in a white community, I forget in what state that was, where we have police that come into our schools, we have security guards, we have metal detectors, we have all these things that continue to make us know, let us know that we're colonized. We're constantly being threatened in every aspect, no matter what we do. We are facing some of the fiercest attacks against our ability to live. We're talking about our employment. Some of the worst unemployment in the nation is right here in Washington, D.C. All of this is the environment of which school closures is happening. Now, what's going to happen in DC when we have all these schools that are closing and then children are bused to different areas to go to other schools. Already there's violence in our schools, already there's contention, already there's poor teachers, poor programming, and it's not because they don't have the funding to do so. They have the funding to do so. They were in the black. I mean, the education budget is there. They just chose not to spend it in those schools. They chose to close it because our children are disposable. And if we don't act at this time, then we're saying that we're going to allow our children to be disposable. And when we privatize our schools, we don't have any control anymore, which is where we're headed. We won't have any control anymore. They can tell your child that you're not going to be able to come here. They can tell you that you have no say-so in what kind of program that's happening. And as long as we keep it in the public sphere, even though it's not good right now, we have some say-so, as long as we organize ourselves to say how we want our children to be educated. So right now, we have, I looked at a list today that said that there are 40 failing schools in Washington, D.C., a majority of which, about 15 schools that are in Ward 8, 10 schools in Ward 7, 4 schools in Ward 6, and the rest are in Wards 5, 4, and 1. And of course, in Wards 8, 7, and 6 is where the majority of the children, our children, are. And so, right now, I can only relate it to what's happening with the housing question. When we're talking about tearing down a housing project and then you're moving these kids that have been fighting with each other to another housing project, it's going to cause more violence. This is going to become a reason for why they're going to need to shut down another housing project and then ship the children to another, or people to another housing project. This is the same thing that's in relation to the schools. There's always going to be a reason why they're going to shut down these schools. And what Tim said was very accurate. We're dealing with symptoms, and we really have to understand the root cause of all of these problems because they're going to continue to happen. So how do we organize in a way that really exposes the root cause? Now, in Philadelphia, which is going through a fierce battle to save its public school system, they brought together a lawsuit that basically said that the school closures were racially motivated. Out of all the schools closed, 11,858 of the students that were affected were black. Only 1,757 were Hispanic, and the rest were white, Asian, etc. So I believe they had a case because the majority of the students that were affected in those districts were black, and they closed them down. And there has to be a struggle that's made from the community. If we just sit by, and even if you say you don't have a child or you don't care about those kids or they're not your kids, there has to be a struggle made by the community because what's left for us in the future is not good. It's not good. I went to, I lived in New York before all the privatization and charter school situations were happening there, and my daughter was in a public school system there. Slowly, they were closing all of the schools. They were making them into IS schools, or like independent schools, or intermediary schools. They took away all of the public programs. They took away all of the electives like art, gym, and they basically taught for test. And so, like, that gave them the reason to say that, oh, they tested out all the kids, and they saw the low-performing schools, they had a reason now to say that they want to turn them into charter schools. Matter of fact, my aunt worked in the charter school there, where they put high schoolers on one floor, and then, no, it was a public school. They put high schoolers on one floor, and they put elementary and junior high school students on second and third floors, all in one school. This is what happens when you close down the rest of the schools and you put everybody into one school. It basically creates a recipe for disaster. There's no way that can be successful. So what they're trying to put out to us is that charter schools are the answer. And of course we see shiny new schools and shiny new lockers, and we think that it's all better. But just like Solomon pointed out in the Credo report, it's not necessarily the correct thing to stake, because they don't do necessarily better in those schools either. So I think what we are trying to do here is really give you a history, give you a reason why we are coming at it as the Black is Back Coalition, and framing it as something that's attacking our children, because it is mostly affecting our children in these areas. And we have to really bring it out and expose it as in that way. I think it's really important for us to do that and actually organize in that way and join other struggles to make sure that this is not going to happen I'm in unity with what Empower DC is calling for, a one-year moratorium, so that we can take a look at how we can change the situation, because the way they're going right now, before the end of, at the start of the school year in 2013, they're going to be relocating students to other schools and shutting down schools. And that's so soon. So I really want everybody to really, during this process as we're explaining, and we're going to later open it up to everybody in the room, so really come up and think about solutions as to how we can really get into the game, how we can go into our communities and organize our students, organize our teachers, organize our parents to come together to make this a mass movement to save DC public schools. I mean, this is small. This is a small area. We know everybody. I've seen all y'all within the last 2 weeks. I've seen some of y'all 2 or 3 times. This is a small place, so I know we can reach out within the community and really get into the teachers, parents, the students, and help to organize something that's really going to affect change and stop the attack on our public school system. So with that said, I don't have anything else, and I'm going to bring it to Parisa, who's going to come up on the stage. She's been doing a lot of work with Empower DC. She's a lot of initiatives, a lot of
Before you do that, before going on with the program. Sorry. Before we go on with the program, I wanted to bring up, before Parisa speaks, I wanted to bring up the National Treasurer of the Black is Back Coalition, Oseno. You guys have an important announcement tonight.
Thank you for coming out. After hearing what Brother Solomon, Aisha, and Rick and Tim have said in here, I want to pose a question to the audience here. Is freedom free? No. I know. Never free. One of the things that we really need to get ourselves out of, brothers and sisters, is we have to expunge this out of our brains that, we're poor, we cannot afford this, we can't afford, for our own, this is our own revolution. So that mindset, we have to really jump out of it, or just expunge it out of our heads. We're the only ones who are going to genuinely fund and finance this revolution that we have embarked on. So what we're trying to do right now is to really engage, in a fundraising drive here. So I know times are hard, and they won't be harder. So we have to really buckle up, and tighten our belts, and get ready to fight back. And the only way we're going to do it, there has to be some resources, within our reach.
For those donations. And next, I want to bring up a member of an organization called Empower DC. Who's been doing a tremendous job organizing the DC community around this issue. Parisa Naruzi. Give her a round of applause.
Thanks so much for having me, and some of my friends with me, Julian and Sky. I'm Parisa from Empower DC. I'm the co-founder of Empower DC. We started back in 2003, and we're community organizers. Our purpose is to build power for low and moderate income people in particular, so that we have the ability to influence the decisions that are impacting our lives. We weren't created to work on any particular issue, but in the District of Columbia, of course, we've always worked on affordable housing, also quality affordable child care. We ran a campaign for several years called the People's Property Campaign, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit. But most of our work essentially is trying to address the issue of displacement and fight displacement, and help DC residents enjoy the benefits of improvements in their community and not be displaced or disenfranchised as a result of that. We got involved in the education issue in 2010. We hadn't been organizing around education prior to that, but as I mentioned, we had this campaign called the People's Property Campaign because we saw citywide that former school buildings were being disposed of, given away to developers, politically connected developers, to build some of the highest cost housing in the city. And of course, we're concerned about the privatization of public property being one of our most valuable resources as a community to use for community development, like affordable housing or small business incubation or something that the private market is not going to give our communities. And it's then been interesting for us as we got involved in the school closures, because essentially that's our work since 2010 in education has been around school closures. We started working with the Bruce Monroe community. Anybody familiar with Bruce Monroe? Georgia Avenue?
Yeah.
Anybody know what happened there?
Made it into a playground.
Yes. Temporary playground. So the Bruce Monroe School was on the list of closures in 2008, but it was a very active student body, parent body. They had good test scores. They had a great Spanish language program. They organized and they got off the list of closures. Then the city said to them, well, you have a terrible building, just move temporarily, and we're going to build you a brand new school. So they moved temporarily, right? The school building was demolished just about a month before the election, before the last mayoral election. And within weeks before the election, that playground was put there with a big sign in front saying, brought to you by Adrian Fenty. And then, of course, Chancellor Reed came back to them and said, well, we don't have the money, we're not going to build you a new school. But that is a prime example of what happens in the city, because this is valuable property. You guys know where that land is? Georgia Avenue and Irving Street, right next to Everlasting Life. Prime property. And, we're just waiting to have to engage in the fight about that property becoming condos, because that playground is considered a temporary use. Another example, we got involved in helping with the River Terrace community. Folks familiar with River Terrace in Ward 7? It's somewhat of an isolated neighborhood in the sense that it's basically a peninsula, surrounded by the Anacostia River off of Benning Road. So you see all the gentrification that's happened along H Street Northeast, right? That continues onto Benning Road, right? You pass the Heckinger Mall, and then you travel a little past the Langston Golf Course. On the right-hand side, you might notice there's a turn into the neighborhood. That's River Terrace. There's only one public building in River Terrace. That's the school. And the school was slated to be closed 2 years ago. And we were able, our organizer Daniel worked very hard with the community there, where they were able to mobilize hundreds of people again and again at forums and rallies to say, we don't close our school. They were able to convince the city to keep it open for another year. And the city promised them, we'll help you boost enrollment over the course of this year. But then the calls went on return for the whole year. So the parents were out there knocking on doors, trying to do enrollment forums and things, and they could get no resources and no support from the city. Until the end of the school year, they finally got their call returned, and the new chancellor, Henderson said to them, we're closing your school. So we've seen that people can dutifully engage in the process that DCPS lays out or the city lays out and just be flat out lied to. There's obviously a much deeper underlying purpose for these closures, and that purpose is displacement and gentrification. The purpose is to destabilize African American communities in particular and make that land available to develop for the newcomers. If you look at River Terrace, there's absolutely no reason why this school should be closed. That's an area where there's a lot of growth and development, but then if you look at it closely, you see exactly why they did it. What's going on around there? They just renovated the river walk around the river, the Anacostia River. What's across the street from River Terrace? The Pepco power plant. For decades, people from River Terrace have been trying to get that thing shut down because it was polluting their neighborhood and causing cancer. Finally, guess what's happened this year? They shut down the plant. They're planning a whole new neighborhood there one day. Then we found this metro map for 2030 that, guess what it shows? A metro stop for River Terrace. Obviously, as you guys know, and when you look at it, you see it, but not everybody in the neighborhood has all that information. And they do have that, obviously, if you've got a kid and, you got to choose between a crumbling school or a brand new school building, that's part of the way that these things are sold to us, is that we see the glossy thing on the outside. Like, people see the cheap prices at Walmart and don't necessarily see what's underlying that, and all the dead bodies and all the blood that is standing upon. We are filing a lawsuit around the school closures in D.C. You might have heard. Yeah. We've been really happy to work in the piece. I recognize some of the voices of our friends from Oakland and others. We've been part of the Journey for Justice, Julianne testified at the Department of Education last month. We were one of the cities that filed a Title VI complaint. And we are trying to learn from each other, city to city, what's going on. We do think that the education lawsuit in DC could be a winner, and it could actually be something that helps boost the movement throughout the country, which is actually kind of what happens in DC, right? A lot of stuff, a lot of social movements have been sparked and supported by the great work of people in the District of Columbia. A lot of times the District of Columbia is the vanguard. So just some of the stuff that's coming up. First of all, we really want to work with you guys. We agree that, it's the 11th hour. We cannot allow this to happen. It's completely unjust. And does anybody know how many white students would be displaced by these closures? One. That's true, actually. One. We've seen two numbers, 1 or 2, but the latest I've heard is 1. There's 15 schools currently on the list to be closed, 13 this year and 2 next year. The 2 to be closed next year, does anybody know which ones those are? Well, that one they're saying they're going to reopen. See, this is real tricky too, because initially the list had 20 on it. One of the schools that they took off the list, they're saying they're not closing, is Malcolm X. But guess what's happened to Malcolm X? It's being turned into a charter. So it is being closed, essentially. But they took it, they're acting as though that's not a closure. The 2 that are closing next year are Mamie D. Lee and Sharp Health, which are the 2 schools for children with special needs. The ones who cannot be in inclusive settings, but really have more vulnerable medical needs, etc. The city is now saying that they're going to move them to River Terrace. Does anybody know where Sharp Health School is? That's right. Prime property. Across from Roosevelt. And Mamie D. Lee, anybody know where that is? Fort Totten, right by the metro, Fort Totten. I mean, you got to look at the pattern of these things because it becomes very, very clear. So we have a couple things coming up. We really need your help. You might have seen this flyer going around. We're having a big, what we hope will be a huge rally, indoor rally in the sense of building support for the lawsuit, introducing the plaintiffs, introducing the legal team, getting folks out to express support and mobilizing folks for the next steps. And that's on March 14th over at Temple of Praise in Southeast near Farabee Hope, which is one of the schools to be closed on the list, but we're going to stop it. And we need to do a lot of street outreach in advance of that. We would welcome help or support or solidarity with door-to-door grassroots work. I know Daniel's planning an outreach day on the 7th, I think it is, a Saturday. Is that the Saturday? No, the 9th? There's the Saturday before that. So we have a sign-up sheet if anybody wants to get involved in that. And then, there's some material in here, some of the numbers and facts. We also are having a fundraiser coming up because obviously we do have to raise money for the lawsuit. Can anybody name one former DC public school that is no longer public? It's now something for the rich. Yeah.
My alma mater, Gage Exeter.
Okay. Tell us about Gage Eckington.
Flower pop right now in the golden pop.
But that Gage Eckington is now the common good. And do you know about the historic school, the Gage School? Because that one is right around here too. And Howard played a role in that one. Gage School was given to Howard for educational purposes. Howard sat on it for years and then flipped it to a developer, and it's now condos. It's not exclusive to Howard. Georgetown did the same thing. There's a school called Wormley in Georgetown. It was given to Georgetown University. They sat on it for years. Then they flipped it to a developer and built condos.
Or the school on Pennsylvania Avenue across from Houston Market, they use Saturday, Sunday.
Hines.
But the
right.
Right.
It's becoming condos. Yep, that one was closed in the last round. Does anybody know how many schools have been closed since 2008? How many? How many schools in DC have been closed since 2008?
About 28, something.
28. Some people say 29. It depends on how you, because they consolidate and stuff, but 28 or 29. And there's about 75 that we know of historically over the last probably 50 years or so. A lot of them are condos. If you look around Capitol Hill, you will find a historic schools turn into condos. And there's also, anybody familiar with the Results Gym on Capitol Hill? Yes. That was a former school building. So that's exactly, we're in this with you guys, and really look forward to continuing to work together. Thanks.
Yes, thank you so much, Marisa. Okay. Yeah, Aisha just told us, told me we raised $185 tonight. Yeah. Tonight, we also want to hear from the parents. I want to bring up Oseno Mbengo once again, who's a member of the African People's Socialist Party, who has children in DC's public school, and he's going to give parental testimony tonight.
Again, thank you very much. And I want to really commend the audience here. Thank you very much. I'm one of those parents, who is sick and tired of being sick and tired. I have 2 children in the public school, and I'm in this thing for the long haul. And I think any parent, PTA meetings, and grandfathers, guardians, we should all organize to really, give these guys the best fight that they have ever seen in their life, And there are 3 good reasons why we're having this event here in this venue. The first reason is that, Howard University is right in the heart of the community. And the second reason is that it's a Black Institute of Higher Learning, right? And then the third reason, which is very, very important, this is the final destination, right? Because we're getting preparing these children, saying that we're educating them, and then from kindergarten to high school, and then finally they'll come here. So I think it's very, very important that we really raise these issues to see the significance of why we're having this event right here at Howard University. Because it is the final destination. Because we are preparing our children to become educated and smart. But then one of the problems that we have encountered is that education in bourgeois society has always been a privilege. It has never been a necessity. And which is what we are fighting for. To make education a necessity for ourselves, to really liberate our people from this, oppressive, and repressive nature of capitalism. And I can begin to tell you how frustrated, because when I go to these PTA meetings and I hear parents, who have been seriously intimidated, about just the horrible buildings in the first place. Sometimes there is no heat during the winter, and worse, during the summer, the ACs break down, constantly. And then we have this Board of Education. And when you go to these PTA meetings, sometimes every now and then they invite them to come in, like these representatives from the DC School Board, or even the district. And when they come in there, it never fails, they always tell the parents to sacrifice. You have to sacrifice for your children. Yeah, I know we all do. And then all of us here who have been from kindergarten all the way to college and become professors, we know what our parents do. And my question is all the time, when are you going to sacrifice? Because here they are, every year they increase their salary. And on top of that, they steal our money too. And then, but some of them are so, stupid anyway, they get caught. So this is the contradiction with this educational system right here. And all it intends to do is to really keep African people ignorant, by inducing conditions that are very not conducive for learning. First, because the buildings, in order to learn, you have to be in an environment that is very conducive for learning. Have, teachers, who really like to teach, because a lot of times, we try to engage, like in this blame game, like the teachers, no, it's the system. There are some teachers, like, who are really, yes, terrible. But the system overall is the system that is run to the core. This system is run to the core. It doesn't intend to give, usable and valuable education to African children. And this is why we have to organize as a community. I think, like getting together with Empower DC, and just generally, any organization around here, we have our points of unity, and I think that should be the thing that should really, consolidate our efforts, as a coalition to really take this, this issue of education, seriously. Because since the advent of this charter school, as Solomon has stated here and others, it's nothing but it's just a plan. Exactly what it is, because they encourage this formation of this charter school while undermining them. Because years ago, I don't know how many of you have, I remember the Marcus Garvey Charter School right next to McKinley. I forgot the sister that was the principal, and they sent them up by sending one of these reporters to go there, and then she provoked an incident and said that, like the principal had shot her, and she fell down and hurt herself. I don't know how many of you remember that. And then less than 6 months after that, they closed the charter school. So it's not the solution to the public school. Like capitalism and this corporate greed and these monsters, want to just, keep things the way they are. Because one comedian had said something, very interesting. He said, there's a reason why education sucks and it's never going to get fixed. So he's telling us to be happy, with what we have, but we are not going to be happy with what we have. As a parent, I will never be satisfied, like with this crap they call education, in here, and every time my children come home, I have to go through this, what's that word again? The program, like from this, and I asked them generally, so did they teach you how to think today at school? And then they look at me and say, yeah, did your teacher teach you how to think? No, that's what I want to be. I want you to become a thinker, somebody who thinks, critically. But the educational system as we see it now, it's completely devoid of trying to induce, thinking, in our children. Because what all they're trying to do is prepare them to be, these corporate monsters and gangsters. Like education is just going to school, get a job, make some money, and then move out of the community, and then say, oh, these people. I think, you hit a point, Solomon. It is very, very important. Because even before I came to this country here, I used to hear about how DC, here, the community was very tight. Even though there were some contradictions, right? We had our own doctors, in the community. If you wanted something, you go to your own account. The community was, very tightly knit. And they started dismembering us, and by, and of course, the educational system had something to do with that, So when they dismembered us, then, the blame started flying all over the place. Oh, black people don't want to learn, and this system is notorious of targeting African boys, African men, young men, And there have been incidents, like with my son, and this day, I went to, we had a hearing. Some small incident happened, and they got into it wasn't even a fight. So they said they were going to suspend my son. And this was at the Capitol Hill Cluster, Stuart Hudson. And I was in Ghana at the time. So they called me, and I was just pissed off, with him, that he would allow himself to be, to be provoked. But then, the outcome, the process of, disciplining these children is always, one-sided. So when I came back, I went there and I had a hearing, with the principal and some representative from the Board of Education. was sensible enough. When he came in there, I laid down the whole history of how America, has always intentionally tried to destroy African boys from when they were young all the way, and then open up the floodgates, put them in prison, and then, make them look like, like they're monsters, and things like that. But I went off there, man, and afterwards, the principal apologized, because they put pressure on it, because the PTA in that school, is mainly, white. And he asked him, would you have done this, in retrospect, would you have suspended him again? He said no. So there are a lot of things, against our children, in this educational system, and it is only left to, it has to be, it's left to us to organize ourselves and, really turn this thing over, right side up, and, make education something that is going to be beneficial for our children and our community. As a parent, I'm really sick and tired of, hearing these, educational, this board of education coming up with all this nonsense, and then, every year, they're just getting richer and richer. Our schools are getting worse and worse. Even textbooks, students have to share it. You make a comparison with these, schools in Washington, D.C. and schools, or just outside of here, Bethesda. Every other year, they build, nice schools, elementary schools, high schools, and so why can't we do it here? The last time I remember high school being, a new school being built in DC, maybe in the last 15 years, I don't think it's more than 2. So this is what we are up against, brothers and sisters. So, and I think, we need to really take this thing, seriously, Join the Black is Back, the coalition, let's form a coalition. All the organizations around here, we have to, because I see this young man running around here, before you know it, he's also going to fall into this trap. So we need to really organize this community, and make education our priority. Education that doesn't serve to enlighten our children or us about ourselves, to me, means nothing. It's useless. Thank you very much.
My name is Sanaa, and I'm the chair of the DC branch of the All African Peoples Development and Empowerment Project. So APDEP is also an organization of the Black is Back coalition here in DC. And I'm really glad to be able to be here and participate in this important town hall meeting. So just briefly about APDEP. APDEP is an African-led development organization that builds for self-determination in African communities. And so what we ask our people to do is to turn their skills back for the benefit of the Black community at large. So we're an international organization with branches all over the US and globally as well. And our projects really vary, everything from healthcare in Sierra Leone to agriculture and gardening in Houston, Texas. So actually here in Washington, D.C., our focus is more on the question of education and the education of our youth. So we've been building and delivering programs around education, primarily in Anacostia and Barry Farms. So as Rich said, I just briefly want to discuss the question of community control of education. Let's say that we're successful right now, and we built this coalition, we fight this fight that needs to be fought, and we prevent the closure of these schools here in DC. Is that enough? Can we all go home and pat ourselves on the back and say that the job is done? No, exactly. There's a lot more that still needs to be done, and the fight doesn't end there. Will our children have a quality education if these schools remain open? Will they have developed the literacy and critical thinking skills that they need to be successful? Will they understand their unique history as African youth? Will they have the ability to understand, to challenge, and to address the state of the Black community? I think we can all agree that the answer to a lot of these questions will still be no, and there's still a lot more work to be done. So one of the initiatives that AppDep is doing here in DC is coordinating something called the Master Scarby Enrichment Program in Anacostia. So for about a year and a half now, we've been running a Saturday school program in Barry Farms. We originally started at a recreation centre there, and now the community has donated a house for us to use as our base there. And we have a Saturday school program, and we're trying to develop additional programs both for adults and for children. And so the curriculum has really tried to focus on some of the issues that our children don't learn about in school. Everything from freedom fighters to their global African identity, to food and agriculture, to even things like community organizing and community development. In addition to those skills, we're also trying to build literacy skills in the youth. So we've got a small library, but we're trying to start up. People have been donating books. We practice reading with the children. We try and do tutoring as well where possible. But this work is in the early stages, and we want to build it further, and we want to call on all of you to get involved and help us grow this program the way that it could be done. But one of the things that's become really apparent through doing this program is that our babies are really struggling. So I'm just going to give one example of one of the young boys that we've been working with. He actually just turned 13 last week. And he's one of the most eager students. He comes every Saturday, and he's there voluntarily. No one is making him come. He really wants to be there. He's eager to learn. But at the same time, he's really struggling with just basic things like reading, reading comprehension, basic math skills. And so I tutored him a little in maths, and he was telling me that he's finding it really hard at school, and they're doing algebra at the moment. And as I worked closely with him, I realized that the reason he's struggling with algebra is because he still hasn't comprehended basic addition, subtraction, multiplication. He's missed out on those basic skills, so now he's completely lost in class. He's not able to follow some of the more advanced stuff that's going on. And so you have this child who's eager to learn. We've seen that through him coming to a Saturday school program. He wants to learn, he's trying. But at the same time he's going to school, he's going to class, he's getting bored, he's getting distracted. Sometimes he's probably being disrupted as well. And as Brother Frieda was just talking about, a lot of that is where the school to prison pipeline begins. Our children are getting disengaged from what's going on in the classrooms, they're becoming disruptive, they're being suspended and expelled, and the spiral just continues from there. And so at the same time, given some of the high rates of adult illiteracy here in DC and beyond, children aren't necessarily getting the support that they need at home. And so you have this cycle that's continuing where they're not getting the help they need in school, their parents are struggling, so they're not necessarily able to give them the help they need at home. And so our children are really being failed. And at the same time, the teachers and schools are way too under-resourced to give children like this young man that I was just talking about the sort of special attention that he needs. And so classrooms end up becoming more of an exercise in crowd control rather than forums for learning. And so I'm not here to blame the teachers, just from my experience teaching in education programs in London and in city schools in London, as well as the enrichment program. I cannot even imagine the sort of hard work that goes into being a teacher. I do it for a few hours a week and I'm exhausted. So, I give complete kudos to people who are able to do this day in, day out, and who are, really dedicated to the education of our children. But at the same time, our teachers aren't being given the environment or the tools that they need to succeed. Which begs the question, who's in control of our schools? It's not the teachers, it's not the parents, and it's not the community at large. Because we know that our schools schools aren't necessarily being run in the best interests of the children. So, as I mentioned, in addition to the children not getting the attention they need to build and develop basic literacy and analytical skills, we also know that the content of the curriculum is failing as well. It's really deficient in a lot of cases. It's curriculum that's being developed from the perspective of the oppressor rather than the oppressed. And so as we continue to entrust the education of our children in the very hands of those who are responsible for a lot of the injustices that our communities are failing, how can we expect the future of our communities to be any brighter than it is now? And so I just want to paraphrase Paulo Freire just really quickly, who's this revolutionary educator. And one of the things that he always says in his writings is that, the oppressor's education system allows them to deposit myths indispensable to the preservation of the status quo. So the education system isn't about changing things, it's about keeping things exactly as they are and normalizing it all so we don't feel like any change is needed. And as Brother Hosseini mentioned earlier, his children are being taught to then just fit into this society rather than try and change it in any way. And so even Black history, it's relegated to 1 month a year, and even then it's sanitized, it's a watered down version that is not liberating or empowering in any way at all. So one of the things we try to do at the enrichment program is teach our children about some of these alternatives, teach them about the Black Panthers, about Marcus Garvey, about Patrice Lumumba, about the Haitian Revolution, whatever it is. But this is still a limited exercise, and a program here and there isn't enough when it comes down to it, when our children, for the remainder of the time, are being taught in someone else's hands. And so even when students manage to escape the school-to-prison pipeline that Brother Frieden was talking about, and become what's considered academically successful, what next? Have they graduated with a true understanding of their place in history, or of their obligation to rise up their communities? We can all agree the answer to that is no. And so we all know that there needs to be a drastic change, and as we work together to try and stop these school closures, something else that the Black is Back Coalition really wants to focus on is working together to build community control of our schools, because all of our children deserve the best, and we should come together to give them that. And so, uhuru, and I just really want to encourage you all to become part of this coalition, become part of the work that's going on here in DC to stop the school closures, but to also not let it end there, to fight together, work together, to reclaim control over the education of our youth. So, uhuru, thank you. So at this part, we're going to open it up for commentary, but I wanted to share two testimonies as a parent myself of a 15-year-old that run the gamut from elementary school up into high school at this point. And she came home one day with a story about they were learning about Malcolm X in school, right? I was like, they're teaching about Malcolm X? Like public school, I didn't know that. But what they were teaching them, it was just like, yeah, the teacher had a negative attitude toward Malcolm X, called him a separatist, and called him a racist. And this is the education, and she knows better. And I'm like, why didn't you challenge her? And because our children, they know better sometimes, and they don't feel comfortable in that environment to say that I'm Black, and I can talk about my heroes and what I know to be true. And I think that a lot of our kids feel like they don't have any voices in the current system that is existing right now. Another story, when she was younger, I went to meet her teacher at parent-teacher night, and she pulls me to the side, the teacher does, and she shows me my daughter's test scores, and she shows that there's a line, and then my daughter's above that line, and all the other kids is below that line. She points out to this boy in the class, to me, I don't know this boy, I don't know his parents, and tells me, he's really low. And I'm just like, what kind of nastiness is this woman just doing right now by pointing out a boy who's struggling in school? And then what they do to those boys, they send them down to the basement, right? And they have no windows down there, and they keep them in the class, and they call it special education. And that's what's happening in our schools right now. So while I think that we should definitely be struggling to stop the privatization of our schools and organize to have community control of our schools, we need to ensure that it is going to contribute to the agenda. Because I ultimately believe that you cannot put your children in these schools and they're going to teach your children to be revolutionary or to think outside of what they want them to think. There's no way it's going to happen. So we have to do as much as we can within our communities. If it means starting up tutoring programs, if it means starting up other elements of educational programs, we need to go ahead and do that. Because leaving them in the hands of the people who don't want your children to learn more than what they do obviously is at the point where we are right now, where they're closing our schools and our children can't even read at the age of 13. And that's heartbreaking. So I'll stop talking, and I want to open up the floor. We don't have a mic on the floor, though, but the room, I guess, is silent enough that we can hear everybody speak. And I would like to get some comments, if there's any. I know you guys have been sitting and listening patiently, and I know that you're bubbling right now with some commentary. And I do want to offer that we have, I have a hand over here. I do want to offer that we would like to hear solutions. We are about building on those solutions. We heard some of the actions that Marisa and Empower DC, I see a hand right there, Empower DC is doing as well. And definitely interested in hearing what your thoughts were. So I'll let John Judge, you had your hand up first, and so I'll let you go ahead and say something. And again, I want to keep everybody's comments short. Is the mic there?
I'm all right. I think people can hear me. I'm John Judge, and Solomon asked me to come to the meeting. And I have some materials up here for a group that works in D.C. We've been going into the school since 1985. It's called Choices, Committee for High School Options and Information on Careers, Education, and Self-Improvement. We are counter-recruiters. We go into the schools because the system uses a poverty draft to force especially people of color, Black and Hispanic and poor people, to see the military as the only choice they have economically to survive the ravages of the Depression. And we try to let young people know what the reality of the military is to them as people of color, as women, going into that system, which is probably the most venal, racist, sexist, and classist organization in the country, and is biased from the gate, because everyone that goes in the military takes a test called the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery. And we finally got the DC schools to stop using it as a skills test, which it is not. But that test has been evaluated from outside, and it is biased along both gender and race lines. So it immediately, that test determines what job you'll get in the military or might get. It immediately routes people of color and women into the dead end and slow promotion jobs in the military. And people of color do not rise in the ranks of the military and the officer corps. They have a program in the high schools that we're trying to get rid of called the Junior ROTC, Reserve Officer Training Corps. That's a total misnomer. They're not training officers. They admit to us that 2% of the people that graduate out of those programs ever become officers in the military. They are teaching them and preparing them to be grunts, to be line troops on the front lines of these endless wars that they're going into. We don't go in without alternatives. We have materials on where young people can get apprenticeships or where they can get other kinds of trainings in job skills and job placement help in the community, where they can get funds to continue their education and not see the military as the system would like. There were serious proposals in the 1980s to make it impossible to go to college if you had not gone to the military first. That's the way they would like to link education. There were even proposals to take young people born out of wedlock by women in the military and raise them on military bases, and after 20 years require a certain amount of military duty from them. Up until just a few years ago, the entire freshman class, young women and young men, were required to take junior ROTC in 7 high schools in D.C. Only the core curriculum knocked that out, and there are still people who have to take it because the teachers think it would be good for them. They claim it teaches them discipline. It does not teach them discipline. It teaches them obedience. Self-discipline is another matter. It teaches them to follow orders and stay in line. It does not teach them a skill. And this is directly related to closing of schools because that program costs over $2 million a year to the DC school system. $2 million a year to take these young people and put them into this military recruiting program. That could be spent on real education, and you could get something like Habitat for Humanity for free in the school. It teaches teamwork. It teaches an actual skill, building a house. It helps someone in the community. It's not marching around in circles with a stick and raising a flag. It's an actual program that could help people, and there are many others like it, but instead, the school system in D.C. spends its money on militarizing these kids. We have a campaign, there's a sheet down here, to protect student privacy from the No Child Left Alone Act, as we call it, which gives their names and their addresses to the recruiters on request, unless the parents and the students know that they can opt out from that. And we try to let them know, and we got something put into the enrollment form each year so that they can opt out of that. We've been fighting to limit recruiter access to the schools. This is child recruitment. It's against international law. And there are international bodies and human rights bodies that have said that they're doing child recruitment here in the United States, and they are. One tool is the delayed entry program, where they hook you up in the military before you get out of school, and before you know about other options, and then they try to scare you into showing up, even though if you just don't show up, you're out of the program. But they tell them, no, they're never going to get a job, they're never going to get federal money, they're going to go to jail if they don't show up because they want to get their quotas. And we're also fighting to get rid of ROTC altogether. And there's information here. Thank you for the time.
Have meetings on what we consider to be a base curricula for what we want to get out of our students, and then implement the thing. And it doesn't take a year, it doesn't take a lot of time, because most of it we can start out right now using the tools that already exist and just overlay whatever we want to use, what we want to put on top of the tools. So if anybody is interested in that, please talk to me, because it's really served no interest to keep coming and talk about what they keep doing, and we never talk about what we're going to do. And I'm kind of irritated by this, because when I was at the high school, they were not interested in teaching anything. They were interested in making sure that the students came so that they can get the dollar, because they get paid by how many students they have enrolled in every day. And so education, like Malcolm said, only a fool will turn over his children to his oppressor. But we keep doing it. But we never talk about what we're going to put as an alternative to their system. We used to have freedom schools. We used to have, I'm a product of the DC public school system, where they actually tried to teach you, because it was a whole different thing. Because when I was coming out of school in the 70s, we weren't that far from segregated, and a lot of the teachers who were still in the school system came out of the 50s and early 60s, out of the segregated DC school system, so they understood what it was. We're long past those days. So if anybody is interested in actually putting together a school system, a system of education that would be focused on the needs and requirements of African people, black people in this century, please talk to me.
Thank you. Anyone else? Comments? Yes, sister.
I just want to say, I'm a mother of 4 children, born and raised in Washington, D.C. And I just want to talk about steps to making sure that a parent doesn't go through what I went through and find out the hard way about charter schools. Okay. I had a son I was frustrated with the public school, and instead of fighting to make the public school better, I yanked him out. Because I thought that this charter school that was sending me literature in the mail every day, and it's a nice, shiny new school, like you said, and they claim all of their students are straight A students, and they all go to college, and everybody's well-behaved, and not knowing the background behind it. I just went on ahead and said, I'm putting them in there. And the public school begged me not to take them out. Don't take them out. You don't know what you're getting into. And I'm like, oh, y'all, y'all just, hating on me going to this new school. I put him in KIP. They expelled him months later. Expelled him over a fight. And prior to that fight, they were writing him up for every little thing, like this brother said, every little thing. They asked him to clean up somebody else's sunflower seeds off the floor. He's like, I'm not touching that. They wrote him up for that. They wrote him up for sucking his teeth. They wrote him up for dropping his pen. They tried to make him wear a rainbow bracelet. He was like, wait, I don't wear no rainbows. They wrote him up for that. So he was so frustrated, and one day he didn't feel like he could trust these people. He didn't feel like he could go to them for help. So he tried to handle all of his situations on his own. So he fought this boy that was bullying him, and they expelled him immediately. So it was a blow to his self-esteem, because he was a straight-A student. He was wondering, what did I do wrong? And that's when I started to research and find out about the dollars behind it, about how they cherry pick. They have an open enrollment, then they cherry pick which kids they want to keep. They still get paid for his spot, even though he's not there anymore. And when I found out, I felt like I was hoodwinked. So I think a step would be, when we do door knock, is to make a fact sheet to explain to parents that these charter schools are not what you think they are. Because now when I try to tell other parents, they don't really believe me. And they think, I'm putting them in this, and then they learn the hard way, and it's a blow to your child's self-esteem. It was a blow to our whole family self-esteem. So just remember, when we do reach out, to let these parents know the grass is not greener on the other side of this charter school stuff.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, I'm just unclear of the objective. So the objective is to save the schools?
The objective is to keep schools public, because
Why?
Because if you do not keep schools public and you allow it to be privatized, because we don't have a system in place right now, currently. We don't have a system in place where a majority of our kids can go to. So if the alternative is that we're going to allow for the privatization or the corporate control of our schools, then we have less say-so in it.
Well, I'm born and raised in D.C. My position is, I think all the schools should be closed, if not burned down. Just because I've seen the results of going to these schools, it's kind of, they should be closed. I mean, they're not good schools. It's, the curriculum isn't in our interest. We're not coming out of them learning how to love each other, how to organize, how to be self-sufficient, how to be sovereign people. So it's like, why are we fighting to keep these institutions open that we send our children to, and we're not getting the desired results, in the interest of our community or our children? So I guess I'm confused. Like, why the hell are we fighting to keep open like Master's Plantation House? And I'm not trying to knock nothing. I'm just trying to get some honest clarity about, because people that know me, like, if I'm gonna fight, I'm gonna ride out.
Right.
But it's like, so I have to be dead set clear on what I'm doing. Like, if I'm going to risk it all, I need to know what the goal is. And so, in understanding this movement per se, I'm very unclear about what the fight is. So if the fight is to keep schools open, and then we're going to send them right back there, and then they're going to educate us in the worst way possible. DC got the worst education system in the nation, and we fight to keep the schools open. So
there were several options that were set from the floor and also from the stage about community control of education. Now
but what's that got to do with these schools closing?
In terms of
as far as community control of the education.
It's part of getting everybody out of the district. That's what it's part of.
But there's so many institutions and strategies in place to do that. This closing of the schools is, to me, and in my primitive perspective, seems like, so what? Like, we got all these, we got food desert issues, we got, murder issues, we got, lack of education. I'm just saying, the list is about 15,000 bullet points.
When you have a child that's in school, and their school gets shut down, and they have to be bused to another school, that hurts that child. That hurts that child that has to be taken out of their comfort zone, and now you got to walk to another neighborhood. You might be beefing with that neighborhood. You might not even want to go to school because you beefing with the people in that neighborhood. Truancy rate go up, and then you decide, I don't even want to go to school anymore. I believe the schools need to be kept open because our tax dollars are paying for that. You got to hold government accountable for this stuff. You can't just let them do whatever they want. We paying taxes on this stuff, and then just let them say we're going to shut it down instead of making it right.
But we paying police officers to lock us up. We paying Safeway to kill us through food. We paying
every issue is going to be 50 million other issues, but this is just one out of a whole lot. Exactly.
And the only reason I posed the question because I'm just trying to get some clarity. I ain't trying to start no beef or none of that. I'm just confused.
I just want to put one thing on the table.
Okay.
That what we really need to do is push to keep our public schools open and push to create programming within the public schools that enhances and enriches our children's experience. The charter schools do not care about our babies. They don't care about our history. They don't care about... But my point is this. When Michelle Reed came down here from wherever the hell she came from, the first thing she came out with was, oh, your children can't learn and your teachers can't teach. That was a lie. A huge lie and an offense to our people. So what we have to do is to take back the power to implement our own programming in our publicly funded, publicly controlled schools. And without that kind of focus, and I'm going to say one more thing. When she fired 266 teachers, she fired 1,000 years of collective knowledge about how to implement educational curricula for our children. Our children are affected by poverty, they're affected by drug abuse, they're affected by violence in our communities. We have 2 or 3 generations of children who are, in a sense, refugees of the crack and gun wars. And we have yet to embrace that truth and create a system of healing that allows our children to reconcile to Uncle Bobby's in jail, or my mother was strung out, or my daddy's dead. When you have that much collective trauma, it's going to affect how you learn. And it also affects how our children deal with one another. So my proposal, in my humble opinion, because I've got 4 children, and one of them is a student in a DC public schools. I'm not necessarily an enemy of charters. I'm an enemy of the system that promotes the lie that charters are inherently better, because they're not. What we have to do is to say what it means to be an African person in America in 2013, and what are we willing to do to make sure that our children don't suffer anymore. How do we make a collective future unfold that embraces our potential? And then we have to work to manifest that potential. So closing down hundreds or tens of schools and putting, right now there are 4,600 children who are about to be in the street. And we cannot depend on charter schools to take them in and give them what we need. We have to do it.
I think that while we have it, while it's in place, and while our children aren't in it, because if they put thousands of our children out on the street, what's the alternative at this point? We're talking about something that's immediate. We're talking about something that's now. If we don't have anything in place, then what are we saying is the alternative? And I think that there should be a struggle to keep the schools public so that we have some semblance of control, because the alternative is we don't have any control. In this meantime, we can also be working to lay down plans, like the brother said, to have our own community education. And so there's not a one singular path to solving this problem. Like, yeah, right now we're talking about keeping our schools public because that's all we have at the moment. That's us all that a majority of parents, of African parents all over the United States have as an option. And closing that down and giving them no option is not a plan at all. But I think that in launching this campaign and moving forward, how do we provide an alternative? How do we solve the problem that we all know that when we put our kids back in these schools, we only have control up to a point. And then what? So we should start building. We should start forming a committee. to form community education? What about connecting these homeschooling projects? What about developing more curriculum and actually putting down plans to have schools in our communities that can actually deal and work with our children? So it cannot be singular, and I think that a lot of us always get stuck in that singular route where one thing is the answer, and it's not. We have to continue to work. There's too many of us to just be focused on one thing. We gotta attack it from all angles, and that's how it's gonna work. Brother back there in the black thing.
Yeah, I wanted to say, actually, I think a lot of people are looking at this too short-sighted on one hand, and also not looking at it as an opening versus a closing. When they're saying that, because I understand what you're saying actually, when they're saying they're closing the schools, actually that's a gigantic opening for us to go to the people and say, look, this is our 20 or 30-year plan. The same way they looked on a subway map and they could see in 2030 or whatever year you said, River Terrace is going to have a subway station. We have to look at it like, okay, we have a plan for 2020, 2030, 2040, and look at it in that sense. Now, like, we're trying to hurry up and prevent this or whatever because it's just doing the same thing. Because in the late 60s, the late 70s, the late 80s, the late 90s, these conversations were going on. The thing is, the prison industrial complex wasn't as complex as it is now. It wasn't as big as it is now, and as profitable as it is now. So when we talk about it now, we got to look at it in the context of DC prisoners are the prime prisoners. I don't know if y'all know that, but the same way they look at the children that get in trouble, they were trying to put your son on the path of juvenile justice and eventually put him on the path of being a DC prisoner that they ship around the country, by the way, more than anybody else, because there's no Lorton. So when they look at a child in school, and I've worked in schools, basically, like Jabari said, just by showing up, they make $10,000 or whatever it is, just by you showing up every year. So that's what tardiness and attendance is really about. It's not about educating you. It's about, nigga, get here so I can get my money. That's what it's really about. And they don't even really hide it to some people. Then the 40 G's for the juvenile justice, or the 40 G's for those who are in prison, or the 100,000 plus all for students who are special ed. I've seen like all kinds of stuff when I used to work in a school in terms of how they make money off of students, and parents don't see it and activists don't talk about it. So when we talk about it, we need to talk about it in that sense, the long-term effects that it can have on these children that are being sent down, not a pipeline, but a highway. This is not a pipeline no more. This is like a super highway to send you to prison, to send you to the military, like the gentleman was saying before, or let's not forget this either. If y'all know about Global 2000 and some of the other reports, let's just say it blatantly, to get rid of useless eaters. Because the thing is, a certain amount of us, well, all of us, are looked at as useless eaters. So it's a certain amount of people that got to die too. So we got to look at it in that sense. Now the other thing we got to do is blatantly tell people about the economics of this. Because for some reason, when people look at things from an economic standpoint, it makes more sense. So the same way when you go on ESPN, you can find out the salary of LeBron James or Carmelo Anthony. We should have a site where you can go and find out, well, wait a minute, they closed this school down and it turned into a condo. Let's find out how many millions were generated because of that. Okay, well, they displaced 3,000 black students and 1 white student. Well, economically, what does that mean to DC? And why was the funding held? If we're in the black, I mean, not we, if the school system is in the black, then why is it that funding is being withheld? And how do we get those funds released? Like, those are some basic things that we can do immediately to blatantly make people wake up and see the bright light. Like, oh, wait a minute. This is what's going on, because I don't think they see it in that context. And the last thing I'll say is, like the brother said, I really think, you know what, forget the schools, F the schools, that's how I feel. I've worked in schools, I've gotten certificates for doing educational projects with young people and coming into schools using hip-hop and all that. But I'll be the first to say, forget about the schools, because the bottom line is, if we're not culturally literate and politically literate, it doesn't mean anything if you have a degree. So our thing should be more about making sure the curriculum changes. You're going to open these schools back up and it's going to have the same curriculum? We don't need that. We need to develop our own community schools that have a real curriculum, that's African-centered, that's back to black is back, that's, you know, the stuff that Jabari was talking about. If it's short of that, then why do we even need a school? It's not even about the building. They can stay home and learn on the internet, if that's the case.
Thank you.
Streets and you talk to people who are directly impacted by this issue, you bring in the analysis that you guys are talking about. You bring in, we don't want to just reopen the school, but we want to reopen it with this. I mean, it's an organizing moment. There's thousands of people directly impacted by this. It's destabilizing communities that have been in place for, 50, 100 years. There are people who value these neighborhood centers, not just as schools, but as the only public place, the only thing that we as a community technically own and could control. We could take back our land. That is our land. And yeah, maybe reopen it as a community-controlled school, but still, it's an organizing moment. And to me, that's the point.
I got a letter from the government the other day. I opened and read it and burned that. Man, the way that I live don't concern that. Man, we gon' have to settle this another way. A letter from the government the other day. I opened and read it and burned that. Man, the way that I live don't concern that. Man, we gon' have to settle this another way.
Movement, music, move into it. Put a fist up, prove it to us. This is much more than music to us.